All right, guys. Good to see everybody tonight. Where'd y'all come from? You weren't in here a minute ago. When I walked in, everybody was just over here. I don't know how y'all got here on this side. So I know that doesn't mean a whole lot to you folks at home, but it's I don't know where they came from. All right. Well, the weather's a little different than last Wednesday. So, you always hesitate on those things because, you feel kind of like, you canceling church for rain always strikes me as a little odd. But then you get to looking at the radar and you're like, this thing probably going to be something. And there was one point last week, we were watching Channel 3. It was right about church time. And they said, we've spotted rotation. And they gave the intersection. And basically, it was right above my house. And so we're watching it going, But anyway, we got through it. But I think it was the right thing to do. But I'm glad we can be back together this week. So, since we are back together, take your Bibles, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And we come to a paragraph where Paul is going to talk about generosity. He's been taking up an offering. He refers several times in his epistles to an offering for the church at Jerusalem. And he's dealing with it in our paragraph tonight. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. It's been obviously... Well, I wasn't here the week before, so it's been 3 weeks since we've been in 2 Corinthians because I was out of town before that. So just let's read the paragraph and then we'll get our settings here. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty has overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urged Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. So he gives them a little paragraph. What he's talking about is an offering that is being taken up for the church at Jerusalem because of persecution and because of circumstances. And this is really hard to think. You would think that the church at Jerusalem, where everything really kicked off, would be the vibrant, sort of center of everything, but it wasn't. It was a very poor, struggling church. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, in the last chapter of 1 Corinthians, he references this same offering, where he says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. And then he tells them what to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. So he's talked to him about this before by letter and obviously when he was with them on a couple of occasions as well. And he mentions it throughout other epistles. So this is one of those things where the churches that Paul was involved in had really partnered together, not unlike the season we're in of Annie Armstrong, or whether it's Lottie Moon or whatever. Our churches combined together to take up this offering for a specific thing. For Annie Armstrong, we're taking up an offering for North American missions, for United States and Canada. And Lottie Moon, we take it up for foreign missionaries. And so this is a very similar thing. It's a very specific offering being taken up for the church at Jerusalem. So what has really prompted him to get to this point is in the previous paragraphs, he's been talking about Titus and Titus coming to him and how he's been encouraged by what Titus has to say and how Titus had interacted with the church. So he's thinking along those lines. So it prompts him to mention this offering. And in it, he talks about the generosity of the churches in Macedonia. So go back to verse 1. He says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. Now, churches of Macedonia most likely are Philippi, where Philippians is written to, Thessalonica, which 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Berea. We're all familiar with Bereans and that sort of thing. Most likely, not most likely, he's writing from that part of the world. Paul's writing from Macedonia. That's why he can talk about the generosity from them that he is experiencing and the thing that he has seen. That's where he is at the time, is in Macedonia. So he begins to commend them. He says, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty has overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So he doesn't say specifically what's happening to the churches that they're experiencing affliction. But in both the letter that he wrote to the Philippians, which is in this area in Macedonia, and in one of the letters he wrote to the Thessalonians, he mentions their difficulties. So let me just read those to you. In Philippians 1, 29 and 30, he says, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Engage in the same conflict that you saw I had and now hear that I still have. So the church at Philippi went through some kind of suffering. And he mentions that here in 2 Corinthians. The church at Thessalonica, he writes to them in 1 Thessalonians 1:6, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction and with joy of the Holy Spirit. So these churches experienced, whether it was outside pressure, whether it was internal conflict, whatever it might be, these are churches that are experiencing difficulty. And in the middle of that difficulty, they are showing amazing generosity for their brothers and sisters in Christ. And those two things tend to go together. There is nothing that will purify and refocus and get the main thing to be the main thing for a church more than some affliction and some persecution. It's one of the reasons the church in North America is so, flabby and out of condition, because we just don't have to do that. We don't go through that kind of stuff. And so we can gather a crowd, we can do church, we can do all the stuff, and not have the main stuff be the main stuff. And we can get away with it, unfortunately. A little persecution would cure that. And so when I see things out in our culture that are completely contrary to the Bible, and you see them infiltrating all parts of life, I do have two thoughts. My one thought is, this is terrible. The world has changed a whole lot just in my time. What is my youngest? What is Tessa? What kind of world is she going to inherit? But at the same time, as the world gets further and further away from the truth of the gospel, what it does is it really defines the difference that we bring. And the fact that the gospel is something that the world needs desperately. That living for Christ is completely contrary to what the current culture is. So it actually ends up setting us apart much more. And that's helpful when it comes to evangelism, when it comes to reaching people. Because if we line up too much with the culture, then it's real easy to fake it. Right? This is one of the issues. But you think about the Judeo-Christian influence, and you think about life in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and all those things. I mean, it was just normal. You move to a new town, you move to a new neighborhood. One of the first things you do, you find a church. You do this, you do that. Preachers would tell me who pastored in the 50s and 60s. They would say, I knew all I had to do. He said, if I knocked on 3 doors in 1 week, I knew one family would come and join my church. Well, now they don't even come to the door. And most likely they're going to call the cops because there's no soliciting. And you're, if you walk into my neighborhood and start knocking on doors, our Facebook page is going to start saying, who are these people? And we're that sort of deal. And so, but what happened in that? All right, can I soapbox for a minute? I'm going to do this. And I've mentioned this before because I think it's related in the theme here. We, as a convention, Southern Baptist Convention, are concerned, and have been for many years, that the number of baptisms has been going down for a long time. And that's true, numbers-wise. My contention, though, is a lot of those baptisms, based on things you've seen later, people being rebaptized or people showing absolutely no fruit of actually having been saved in the first place, a lot of those baptisms weren't real in the first place. That number represents the number of folks we got into the baptistry and got them wet, but it doesn't actually represent how many people are actually saved. And so we really can't know, what does that number actually reflect? So when the culture is so much more accepting of things, of joining a church, of at least trying to live up to a Christian ethic, it does life in general, is much more ethical. But it's real easy for the need for the true need for the gospel, the true need for separation. Those things aren't as clear. So as the world becomes more outwardly wicked, which is clearly what we see, what it does is it begins to more clearly delineate what we stand for. And it's a much better jumping off point of saying when you give your life to Jesus, you are committing to something radically different than what the world offers. And so that to me, that's a good thing. And so these churches are experiencing affliction, most likely persecution from the outside. Satan's probably messing with them from the inside. But in the middle of that, in verse 2, he says, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy. So they find joy in the affliction. They're not down in the mouth about it. They're not, oh, woe is us. They're not, all upset. There's joy in that. And then it says, and their extreme poverty, so they don't have any money, have overflowed in a wealth of generosity. So even though they don't have much, they're giving much. And that's a relative thing, that's the widow's mite. Jesus made that very clear. He talked about the widow who dropped the small coin. She gave more than everybody else. Well, if you put it in a spreadsheet, she didn't. There's a lot of people who gave more money than she did, but she gave more than they did because she gave, out of her everything that she had. And so, they were giving out of their extra. So these churches are experiencing difficulty, and what that has done is brought in a robust generosity. And that's what happens. That's what I've seen. I know you've seen it too. As people really begin to struggle in areas, as maybe they've got family difficulties or health difficulties, something where the Lord's really growing them in their faith, they then have opportunities to minister to other people. And the Lord uses that. And that's exactly what's happening here. So in verse 3, he makes it clear. He says, for they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means. And then here it is, of their own accord. So they gave more. He was really surprised. Paul was like, wow, this is really amazing what these folks have given. And here's what I've learned about God's people over time. Our church is extremely generous. I even in, my almost 3 years here, I have seen it. We've had families who have struggled at times, and Sunday school classes step up and just take care of things. And giving and all that stuff, just very generous. And I've seen that in other places where I've served. I remember we were in our first church. We had a parsonage on the property. In fact, the current pastor still lives in that house. But when I first got there, we were to the point we either needed to knock the house down or redo it. You couldn't live in it in the state it was in. So, because it had been abandoned for years and nobody lived in there. Anyway. So the church voted to redo the parsonage, and then we were living in our first little starter house. And when they finished it, Donna and the girls and I, and at the time it was just Emma with Sarah on the way, we're going to move in to the parsonage. And so this would have been 2004. We, in a business meeting, set aside $10,000. That's what we're going to set aside to redo the parsonage. Well, we ended up having to come back, and we got a little bit more money, and the church approved that, and then we were almost done. Now, this is a small church, small budget. Our entire budget at the time was not $100,000. It wasn't even that. And we needed like another $2,000, or either $1,000 or $2,000. And basically what happened, it was a Wednesday night in prayer meeting. I just said, guys, this is what we need to finish the parsonage. We need $1,000 or $2,000. I don't remember what it was. Well, within 2 or 3 minutes, we had it, because somebody in the back said, I'll give $250, and somebody over here said, yeah, I'll give $300, and then boom, 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 we had it, and we finished it, and we lived there in that house for about 7 years. You guys have seen that kind of thing too. If you've been in building programs, if you've been in Sunday school classes where you're trying to support somebody, when God's people really get serious about being generous, it's amazing, because it all belongs to the Lord. It's His money. And because He's talking about actual money here, that's what they're giving. They're taking up an actual collection, and they're being very generous with it. And it's always an amazing thing to see when God's people get serious about this, what He does through this and how people can be blessed. You've seen the tears of joy when people who thought they were going to lose their house, or they didn't know how they were going to get their car repaired, or whatever it was, and believers come through for them. It's an amazing thing to see, and that's what this church is doing. So Paul's really bragging on them here in a good way. Verse 4, he says, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. The churches in Macedonia, Philippi and Thessalonica are like, Paul, we don't have anything, but we want to help. We want to give. And they end up giving beyond their means. They just want to be involved. Verse 5, and this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, so their commitment was to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. In other words, they partnered with Paul. They were walking with the Lord. They were under affliction. They were under persecution. They were being obedient to the Lord, and they saw an opportunity, and they got involved with it. Many of y'all been through Experiencing God? You remember that Henry Blackaby study? It was real popular in the mid-90s through early 2000s. One of the things that came out of that was find out where God is working and get on board. And it's a great one of the principles that comes out of that study. And that's what they're seeing. This church is seeing that this collection is being taken up for where this whole thing got started, the church at Jerusalem, where most likely James, the brother of Jesus, is probably the main leader by now, because all the other disciples have scattered, and they've gone to other places to share the gospel. And so they're wanting to help. The Lord is doing something, and they're just a part of it. And that's part of the great thing about giving to missions or giving to church planting or whatever it might be, that we get to be involved in something beyond the walls of our church. And we get to do that, and that's a great thing. So then he starts to get personal. In verse 6, he says, accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you, so now he's talking to the church at Corinth, this act of grace. So what's he doing? He's bragging on the churches in Philippi and Thessalonica, the churches in Macedonia, and he's saying these guys are giving well beyond their means. And then he says, and I've sent Titus to you, because you guys need to get involved in this too. You guys need to be a part of this as well. So he's encouraging them to get involved in giving. I mean, we had the Annie Armstrong video on the screen this week. It really is. The Southern Baptist Convention is not perfect, and we've got a lot of internal squabbling and fighting right now. I told y'all Sunday night, SBC Twitter is a horrible thing to watch. But I think, we're really blessed in that we have the best missions organization and the best way to do missions of any denomination that I'm aware of. Because we've chosen to partner together as churches so that our missionaries, when they go overseas, they don't have to raise their own support. We give to the cooperative program, and that funds them to be able to go, and they can stay on the field much longer before they have to come back and get some relief and come back and report. But if you guys are familiar with other mission agencies, and maybe you support some of those, and there's some really good ones out there, often those missionaries come back every year, and they may be back home for 2 or 3 months a year, reporting back to the churches that are giving to them individually. And they couldn't get there in the first place unless they had drummed up, enough support to even get there. With us as Southern Baptist, if God has called somebody to the mission field and they get connected with the International Mission Board, all that is funded. And they're able to really focus on making disciples and planting churches and doing all those things. And we can provide for their health, health insurance and travel. And if there's an emergency, we can get them off the field real quick. You hear stories about missionaries whose kids have medical emergencies, or maybe a civil war breaks out in a country that they're in. We can get them out. We have the resources and get them out quickly. And that's because we give to the cooperative program. It's because we give to Lottie Moon. It's because we give to Annie Armstrong. And we need to be generous in that. That's what's happening here on a much smaller scale. And these folks are being generous, and Paul's commending them for it and encouraging the church at Corinth to do the same. So in verse 7, he sort of reminds them of who they are. He says, "But as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also." In other words, he's saying, make sure that your giving and generosity match up with the rest of your walk with the Lord. And so he's encouraging them to get involved and to give to help the church in Jerusalem that is struggling. And so it's really a great, I don't know, I don't remember a missionary sermon from this paragraph. I think this would probably be a good one. But that's what he's doing here. Basically, he's calling them to get involved with others who are struggling and to help them so that they can continue to serve the Lord. The sentence I wrote out as far as a point of all this is simply this: knowing God means living with generosity. If we know the Lord, we should be the most generous people, because what's he given us? Well, he's given us everything. He's given us life. He's saved us. He's rescued us from eternal death. Everything that we have, he has given us. You have used your, whatever success you've had in the work world, or whatever industry you're in, the success that you've had in that, yes, you've worked hard, and yes, you've put in the time, but who gave you your mind? Who gave you your ability? Who's the one that put you in that position? It was the Lord. And you could have really messed all that up, and yet you didn't, and you didn't because of who he is and because of who you are in him. And so that should prompt us to be generous towards others. And so, since we are talking and we are in Annie Armstrong time of year, think about those offerings. When it comes to Annie Armstrong, when it comes to Lottie Moon, those are times for us to do what we're seeing here, to support people that God has called to the other side of the world or to the other side of the United States. There are people all over who God has called out to go and to preach the gospel, and we have a chance to be involved in that and to aid them. And so it's just, to me, it's just an encouraging paragraph, and in a book where, Paul's had some issues with this church. I mean, he ends up writing 4 letters to them. God preserved 2. And a couple of them were kind of heated, and they've had some conflict, and yet, despite the fact that they're an imperfect church, they get to be involved in this too. And so every church is able to do this on a different level. Our church, when you look, here at Covenant, because of our budget, we are, in that upper echelon of giving. The Lord has done that. I mean, he's blessed us financially in that way. But our faithfulness is no different than the church that has 20 and has a bivocational pastor who is doing the exact same thing we are out of what the Lord has given them. They're just as faithful, and they're just as important, and they're just as big a part of that. And that's the great thing about the kingdom, is God has placed us where we are, and we just serve him where he's put us. And we're to be obedient there, and he honors that. So just an encouraging paragraph there in 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 7. Next week we'll pause. We'll take another week off from 2 Corinthians, and we'll look at the crucifixion, because we'll be in between Palm Sunday and Easter. And so we'll probably be in Luke next week, and then we'll get back into 2 Corinthians the week after that. But that is, especially for those of you watching online, that is 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 7. And so for those of you who are watching, whether it's tonight or maybe on YouTube later, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask, you can send a Facebook message or an email to John, John, at mycbcc.org. And hopefully we can answer any questions that you might have. But thank you guys for being here. We're going to log off now and go to our prayer time. But thank you.